Today's edition of the Spot Track Podcast is presented by Bettor Edge. Visit bettoredge.com or download the app in the iOS App Store today and get cracking. Use code SPOTTRACK. Grab yourself $20 on the house and use it on NFL bets, MLB playoff bets, competitions, brackets, pools, and even flash markets, their newest and latest and greatest. Again, that's code SPOTTRACK at bettoredge.com. My name is Mike Ginnitti. It's Friday, October 3rd. Waited a minute on this pod to let the Major League Baseball postseason percolate itself into the divisional round, which is where we are with Detroit, the Yankees, and the Cubs moving on to the next round. Pretty much status quo here. I think this is exactly how we assumed things would go. Not without drama, though. Plenty of great matchups this week. Lots of nice day ball. Pretty much everything you could ask for from Major League Baseball outside of the fact that there's a couple of, Goliath teams sitting at home right now or on the golf course doing their thing. But good starts to the postseason for the league itself and some of the superstars that come with that. Obviously, we'll keep our attention on both what's happening in the postseason and in the offseason. We haven't yet heard about an Alex Bregman opt-out like we did with Alonso 45 seconds after the Mets lost to finish their regular season. But those are the kind of things we're watching, including already pushing the envelope towards arbitration, salaries, option decisions, 2026 payroll projections, tax payroll projections. We're in full swing over here with Major League Baseball. So any questions, thoughts, suggestions, recommendations, hit us up on socials at SpotTrack, SPOTRAC. Here's the gamut for today. A little bit NFL to start here. Speaking of early thoughts, I put out a poll, more of a Twitter mailbag this week regarding who should be traded, who's going to be traded, which name should we be thinking about. We had some names internally, obviously, that we've been tracking, and we're about to launch both a trade candidate view with all the financials ramifications for that and a beefed up version of our NFL trade machine, which you can now find on the NFL site linked with SpotTrack. More to come on that as we continue to progress, but we have some names. So we'll start with that. Maybe 7 or 8 names that we should all start to be thinking about for that November 4th trade deadline. Then we're going to flip the switch to, believe it or not, hockey. It's time. We're about 10 days out here, and a lot has happened. Hockey is worthy of our conversation right now. I'm a big hockey guy. Season tickets here in Buffalo for quite a long time. Obviously, not worthy of that the past decade or so, but we'll see. That doesn't mean I don't follow it. Obviously, we track it. The numbers are all kind of have been stagnant, certainly through the COVID years. And that's sort of the point here. We're kind of getting ourselves away from all the COVID buybacks and the sharing systems. The salary cap has progressed, not only this year, but significantly over the next 2 years, based on what the NHL has already told us. And there's a brand new CBA that has quite a few tidbits worthy of talking about here. And along with that comes a rash of signings at the end of the offseason here, and one notable one in Kaprizov that should A, be broken down, which we're going to do, and then B, is going to lead us to our next conversation, and maybe the biggest conversation within the sport, which is what the hell is next for Connor McDavid? Because if this guy is a $17 million player and 16% of the cap, what is next for one of the biggest alphas this sport has ever seen, who is on an expiring contract with this new CBA, what the terms mean, and where things could be headed for that entire situation in Edmonton now over the course of the next few months, maybe into next offseason if it gets that far. And then I'm going to break down these CBA tidbits, as much of them as possible, as much of them that are relevant to what we do here with the salary cap and the injury reserve stuff and the salary cap itself. So that's the gamut. Little NFL. We're going to flip the switch to some of these contract breakdowns in the NHL, and then we're going to run through the greatest hits of this new NHL CBA, which even if you're not an NHL person, stick with me on this one, because there's some crossover to what's happening with Major League Baseball and their looming CBA and how the NBA is structured, and how I think, A, the NHL has monitored that and where things may change for NHL contracts from the player and agent standpoint in the very near future. So that's what's next. Before we get cracking, let's get to our Bettor Edge bet of the week. Instead of me making a bet, I'm going to present one out there to the world because this should be live by the time you're listening or watching this episode of the Spot Track podcast on Bettor Edge, of course, our partner and sponsor. And we've partnered to the point of where we're now starting to create some content in conjunction. And what does that mean? We've been mentioning these flash markets that exist on Bettor Edge. It's pretty exciting stuff. And what does this mean? It means we can bring some of our content and some of our biggest questions and futures to the Bettor Edge system, and you can start to make some money off it. So we're opening the floodgates with Pete Alonso, the aforementioned Pete Alonso, who has already verbally opted out of his contract with the Mets, which means he is going to be a free agent in the next month. And that means probably a new destination. There are certainly plenty of Mets fans who want him back in the National League East, but I think this time around, it's going to take a hell of a lot more. Certainly a 5 to 6 year contract on the books, probably around that $30 million per year mark, which is what he earned in 2025 and certainly produced at that level. So you tell us, visit Bettor Edge, open up the Spot Track Flash Market. This will also be available on spottrack.com. We'll be pushing out at the socials as well. Which division does Pete Alonso land in this time around in free agency? All right, let's get to the NFL. It's not trade candidate season yet, but we are a month away from this trade deadline. Week 9, November 4th is the actual deadline. As I mentioned in the open, I put out a poll. I got some names. I have some names. Things are going to change, obviously, week to week with injuries and whatnot. But I think at least right now, these are some significant names to be thinking about for that November 4th deadline. And again, we're launching a trade candidate view that allows you to see the financials in real time and at the deadline, and a trade machine to go out there and play with, including draft picks and all sorts of things that you need to compile these things for your actual team. So will Russell Wilson be traded? Will Kirk Cousins be traded? Those are the big names at the quarterback position, at least right now. You know, we can throw Jameis Winston in there. He hasn't seen a field in a long time. We can throw Anthony Richardson in there to see if a team wants to take a midseason flyer and get him in their system for the upcoming offseason. We've seen that work in the past. But those are the names of that list. I think those are pretty tongue-in-cheek at this point in time. The running backs, you know, we do see running backs move at the deadline because it's a bit of a plug-and-play situation, and it's one of the more aggressively injured positions in all of football. We've seen the Chargers go through this. The Jets just lost their backup. So Breece Hall was going to be one of the top candidates, in my opinion, expiring contract, not likely to re-sign with the Jets. But Braylon Allen's out for an extended period of time, at least 4 weeks, and it sounds like more. Breece Hall is going to have a huge role here. Now, you can look at that two ways. Breece Hall gets a ton of run, furthers his candidacy as belonging on a good team. And if the Jets are still piss poor and miserable, which I think the expectations are that they will be by week 8, by week 9, he'll be one of the most notable desired players on the list. And why would the Jets want to keep him around, you know, on a sinking ship that he has no future on? So I'm going to keep him in mind, but I think for the next at least 2 to 3 weeks, as the Jets continue to kind of spin their wheels, he's just going to be their featured offense. So for now, we'll pause on Breece Hall. With that said, I think the Saints have shown us enough that, you know, and by the way, we all knew this heading into the season when we saw the roster, the starting quarterback, etc. The Saints are a sinking ship, and that's just fine for what they've had to become financially and certainly from a roster standpoint. And Alvin Kamara doesn't belong on that ship anymore. He's too talented, even at his age, even with his workload and his history. He's just too talented and fun to be on this team for 17 weeks. And I do think your contending teams, even the ones that have a back, this is going to be one of those guys that you're going to want to drop in on week 8 and say, let's do this. Okay, let's manage the workload for you versus what we already have. And let's make this a 10-week, 12-week run, not just an 8-week run into January and possibly February. So Alvin Kamara squarely on this list. Fingers crossed he stays healthy on this terrible Saints team for the next few weeks. And then they do right by him after a really nice long tenure with New Orleans. Wide receivers are funny we generally do see wide receivers move. We generally don't see the wide receivers that move pan out. Okay, even good ones, right? Even, Amari Cooper a couple times here has been sort of the poster child for this. But I'm going to give you 3 names, and they're all kind of strange. But I think after this week specifically, we will know more about these 3 names specifically in the team and their respective teams. The first one's going to be Jacoby Myers, who's on an expiring contract, didn't get the extension he was hoping for with Vegas, even though for all intents, he was going to be the featured, pass catching option, especially with Brock Bowers and his knee situation just in the tank right now. If Vegas loses this week, and the expectation is that they will, and they start to slip away from division hopes, this is something to monitor, because I don't think Jacoby Myers has a future with this organization. He will be testing the open market in March. I don't think he's a franchise tag candidate for everything they have going there. And by the way, if Geno Smith doesn't work out, right, there's a lot more that needs to be ripped away than just Jacoby Myers. So he's definitely one to monitor. He is an absolute plug and play wide receiver. He's a targets guy. He's an over the middle guy. He's done a little bit of everything. And he was one of those players that was standing out in New England when nobody else in that organization was. This was the post Brady, the post Belichick, but Jacoby Myers was still kind of putting his foot down. He'll be a desired option, despite the fact that it's somewhat of an expensive contract. Calvin Ridley probably isn't a bona fide number 1. We've learned that now from 2 different teams, maybe even 3 different teams. And if Tennessee is going down, not up this season, despite the fact that I think Cam Ward has shown some good things, maybe you get some value there and try to get yourself a mid-round pick to maybe replace him in the 2026 draft. And then DJ Moore. Chicago looks good, but Chicago looks good despite not having used DJ Moore, right? Rome Odunze certainly is the option coming forward. We've seen some Luther Burden in his first 4 weeks kind of step into the forefront, and they've got 2 tight ends in Loveland and Cole Kmet that are big-time options out of the backfield. It seems like DJ Moore, despite his massive contract, this is basically a 2.5 guarantee left on this contract, and they gave up the world. It seems like maybe he might be the odd man out here. And this is what I was talking about with the next couple of weeks. Maybe they try to move, find more targets for him. Maybe he finds his way into this offensive scheme for Ben Johnson, and maybe not. Maybe it's just not the right fit for him, or there are better options, better weapons superseding him at this point in time. Either way, it's an expensive trade. It's not a rental trade. So you're looking for a team that wants to upgrade their fringe WR2, WR1 for the next couple of seasons. I think there are teams like that out there, right? I think the New Englands of the world and maybe a few more have this kind of situation in mind. Maybe even Tennessee, if they're looking to upgrade from Calvin Ridley. I think DJ Moore is an upgrade from Calvin Ridley. So I do think there's room for this at the deadline. DJ Moore is probably a more likely off-season trade candidate. However, we could get to a situation over the next couple of weeks where if he is standing on the sideline, not unlike what we're seeing with A.J. Brown, though I'm not going to make him a trade candidate just yet because Philly's going to Philly. But if we get to that point where he is just an innocent bystander on this offense and he knows he doesn't have a future here, player and agents start to get vocal, start to see some things happen on Twitter or on Instagram, and all of a sudden, we're approaching that November 4th deadline, all talking about the fact that DJ Moore wants to get the hell out of Chicago. Certainly a plausible situation. I think David Njoku in Cleveland could be on a similar path. Look, the Browns, I get it. They're kind of stuck here in the situation now with Flacco and with Watson's contract. They're going to go with Dylan Gabriel. They're going to want to give Gabriel the best available chance to succeed over the next couple of weeks here. And there's a world where that looks great, and they're going to want to keep everything intact. The entire offensive line is basically on an expiring contract, with the exception of Jack Conklin, who could very well be. So that's going to see some changes. And Njoku can be moved on from a guarantee standpoint after 2025. So it's essentially a rental for a new team looking to kind of poach a player that they need to fill an injury with. I think teams poke at this a little bit. And depending on how the next 3 weeks with Dylan Gabriel go, I think will tell us a lot about if they're willing to give up on players like this or if they feel like they need to keep players like this to better protect the Dylan Gabriel start. I guess the same conversation can be said about the Miami Dolphins and a bunch of their players. Obviously, Tyreek Hill is no longer a trade candidate, unfortunately, and best wishes to him and his recovery. But there will be others. I don't think we get to a point where Achane and some of those weapons move, necessarily speaking, because they're young and controlled, and you want to do what you can do with them for the next iteration. Tua's got one more fully guaranteed year here left before you start talking about moving on from him, though you could certainly start to replace him from a roster standpoint. But I think Bradley Chubb is the name. Teams, real good teams right now that are eyeing February, need help in pass rush, and certainly injuries are going to happen over the course of the next month. And Bradley Chubb signed a renegotiated contract. It's a 3-year deal, but it's only a 2025 guarantee. Everything else after this season is year to year. The cap hits skyrocket from Miami after the season, so something's going to give either way in February, most likely. And if there's trade value out there for this guy, and I think there will be, this is probably the big name to move in the next few weeks for Miami to a contender for a decent amount of trade chips. So that's the one to watch there, I think, out of the Dolphins, respectively speaking. New England's been trying to trade Kyle Duggar, the safety, for a while. I don't think it gets to that point, despite the fact that they might be a near 500 team. It's just an albatross of a contract, and New England shouldn't be in the business of retaining salary right now to buy a 6th or 7th round pick. That's just not good business for them. They have purged their financials properly. They're in a good position to strike big again next offseason, like they did this offseason. And you just kind of keep grinding out this Drake May thing, as they did with Mac Jones, and obviously that faltered. But I think they're going to have to give themselves more positives than negatives over the course of the next few months as they look towards March. And by the way, maybe I'm speaking out of turn. Maybe this is a wild card team that makes some noise this season and does a lot more than I'm giving them credit for here. But in other words, less subtraction, more addition right now than anything for the New England Patriots. Back to the Browns for my last name. Greg Newsome, cornerback, first-round pick for them. Certainly hasn't fully panned out, but also isn't, a nothing. He's not a zero heading to the trade deadline. There's Denzel Ward stuff. He probably falls off this roster. Obviously the Garrett stuff got resurrected, but if we're heading towards a situation where the Watson contract's going to fall off, and I think it's going to happen in a post-June 1st move, 2026 is just going to be so damn expensive. And then obviously 2027 will have an even more inflated dead cap because of this move. They're going to have to start to think about not only who they can keep, but what it's going to take to keep players. And somebody like Newsom's going to need, a second-tier cornerback contract. So if that's not in the cards, and I don't believe it is, and I don't believe it can be with where they're headed over the next 18 months, is there a nice draft pick sitting out there for them right now for this player? It's a good defense, and losing him would put them down to the bottom probably. But in 3 weeks, that might be exactly where they want to be heading anyway. So look for Cleveland with a couple of instances. I definitely consider more Jets players. That was when I put the tweet out asking for names from the bleachers. I got a hell of a lot of Jets players. I got some Ravens. I understand that, right? Mark Andrews, maybe Isaiah Likely. Tyler Lindenbaum needs a contract. I mentioned him last week. If they're going to move on from some offensive linemen that they don't want to pay, my goodness, could they get trade value for that? But we'll see. Jets are sellers. Saints should be sellers. Browns should be thinking about selling. Dolphins are mini sellers because there's just a lot of expensive cap hits on that roster right now. And then obviously where the Giants head with Wilson and Jameis Winston and maybe some other players on that roster as well, depending on how their next 4 weeks go on the field. Let's flip the switch to the NHL. All right, as I mentioned in the open, Kirill Kaprizov signed a historic 8-year, $136 million extension that starts next season with the Minnesota Wild. It's historic in three ways, okay? The 136 total value is first all-time. The $17 million per year is first all-time. The percent of cap, which starts next season at 16.3, is historic. And that signing bonus right there, 128, is historic. So every way you slice this one, it's big, and I think most would agree it's an overpay. It's one of those Dallas Cowboys situations that Minnesota got them into where it got real late in the game. They weren't going to want to wait. The player didn't want to wait, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute here when I talk about some of the new CBA stuff. But everybody kind of got backed into a corner here, and Minnesota decided these numbers would suffice. It's certainly not a max, but it's definitely more than, I think the 15 or so per year that was being projected on an annual term. And to get this AAV at this total max term is a pretty impressive haul for Kaprizov this late in the stage, who now is signed through the 2033 season. So these percents, this is what we're here to talk about for the most part going forward as we flip the switch here to McDavid. But this is one of those contracts where you put a flag in the ground and say, things are different now. Things are different now because, well, A, we're never going to have another 8-year contract because this is the final off season for that. But B, with the cap going up significantly, something we're going to flip the switch to here in 30 seconds, will players actually want to be putting themselves on these 8-year terms? Or will teams and agents and players all collectively come together and say, if the league is healthy and the league is telling us financially that they're healthy, that their COVID buyback stuff, plus the revenue they generated, plus some of these CBA changes, which is going to generate more revenue, has gotten them to a place where they are stabilizing. Okay. The players don't have to have salaries and escrow year to year, things like that. That was somewhat concerning for the past decade or so with this league. I think the league is telling us they're fairly healthy. They're probably going to move on from Gary Bettman at some point over the course of the next, or certainly through this iteration of the CBA. So we could be in a point where major changes are happening, and maybe that should be the case with these NHL contracts. So I'm showing you kind of this big, giant Goliath contract of Kaprizov that broke every record possible, okay? Is nicely front-loaded, by the way, which is what these contracts should be. Younger here, older here. It's just how these things should work. But where does this leave us? Because while this guy probably did get overpaid, the guy we're going to transition to here, McDavid, is sitting on a $12.5 million contract, did not max out his percent of cap last time around. And now we're sitting with a new CBA, a players association that wants to be aggressive because they've gotten a lot of wins out of the CBA. They took some L's. The league is telling us out loud, things are pretty solid right now. We're going to boost these caps easily over the next 3 seasons, starting with this season. So the biggest superstar that this league has had, I guess since Crosby, but I think to a higher degree because of the athleticism and the star power and the marketability of McDavid, and the fact that he's going to be a free agent this time next July, barring an extension. All of those things collectively, I think, have us focused on what is going to happen. How is the Kaprizov contract going to bring us to McDavid, and what will McDavid do to either continue the way things have been like this, these long-term spread out contracts, or take us into a different version of the NHL. I'm going to pivot here and bring in co-founder and NBA data apologist Scott Allen to have this conversation with me, because I think this is as much an NBA conversation as it is an NHL one. All right, Scott. So I just broke down the latest and greatest 8-year extension in the NHL, Kirill Kaprizov. Where I'm heading in the next 10 minutes on this pod is diving deep into this new NHL CBA. All right. So I know you haven't done that. I know you have absolutely no connection to these NHL salaries and contracts right now, but a lot of things are going to change with this CBA. All right. I've done my homework over a couple of cups of coffee this morning, and I've been following this now for the past month and a half or so. But long story short, the 8-year contract is gone. Okay. It's dropped down to a max 7 to stay, a max 6 to go elsewhere. The salary caps are ballooning in the NHL. So they've gone from 88 basically for all of COVID as they stabilized and sort of did a buyback program. And now it's jumped up to 95.5 this year. It's going to 104 next year, and then it's going to skyrocket to 113.5 in 2 seasons. So a couple things here. Number one, that's a positive sign. Okay, there's some health here. It means that the measures they took through COVID, plus this new CBA, plus some other things, have broken right for them. I mean, they feel healthy. But the reason I'm bringing you in is this is very NBA-ish. Okay, so not only have they kind of survived and weathered their storm a little bit here, but now they're headed to a place with this CBA that's final. It was a very positive negotiation process. The PA and the league itself really didn't ruffle any feathers, publicly speaking, at least. And they got to this thing way earlier than most of us thought they were going to get to, which means, again, both sides feel pretty good about this league right now. But the thing that stood out the most to me is they already announced the 2027 salary cap. They're boasting the fact that this salary cap is going up 999 for 3 straight seasons. And now teams can budget accordingly for it. Okay. And that's a very NBA move. Okay. This is why Keith Smith does what Keith Smith does, because he can look at what's happening today and he can also tell you what's going to happen in 2.5 years. Because the league is very mathematically based. Okay. There's percentage of caps, et cetera, et cetera. We know the salary caps. We now know the apron situations. And if you put enough time into it, you can kind of do their GM's work for them, which is what Keith does for us quite a bit. The NHL is about to get there. Okay, the NHL is telling us out loud, here's the 3-year span, figure it out. And oh, by the way, Connor McDavid is a free agent in less than 12 months. Okay, so Kaprizov just scored $17 million next year. It's 16.3% of the cap. The max percent of cap in the NHL is 20, which means that Connor McDavid can walk into a $20.8 million per year, 7-year contract next season to stay in Edmonton. Okay. Now, I've just given you a hell of a lot to swallow, but I know all of that seems familiar to you because this is exactly how the NBA has been operating for a very long time, and I think successfully. And it's very easy for fans to grasp onto it because it's so mathematical. You know what I mean? No player has maxed out in this recent iteration of massive extensions in the NHL. No player has done it. No, every single player, including the superstars, has given their team some sort of percentage discount. The PA, as I have been reading all morning, is adamant that Connor McDavid does not do this. They want all of these warning signs and these symptoms and these cap increases and the new CBA to mean that McDavid, as the clear superstar in this league, the Kobe Bryant, essentially, right, of this league right now, the one single player that should never take a discount, the Peyton Manning in the NFL, never take a discount because the second you do, everybody else is going to feel like they have to also. The PA has come out and said, Connor McDavid, you must go to 20%. You must. Which leads me to believe, and I think of a couple of other sources as well, that Connor McDavid's not going 7 years next year. That Connor McDavid might go 3 years or 4 years. Or, and here's why you're here, are we getting there? Are we getting to a moment in the NHL where Connor McDavid is going to LeBron James this thing? And he's going to sign a 1-year, $20.8 million contract, probably to stay in Edmonton for 1 more year and give them a chance, and then retake July 1st, 2027 free agency at a $113 million salary cap when he can now get a $22 million single multi-year contract, etc. I think we're having this moment right now. And I think this is what the Players Association is begging for. Certainly there's an injury scare. But for the most part, Scott, the reason we have 7 and 8-year contracts, similar to what we had in baseball for all those years, is to spread out the AAV, is to get us to a point where teams can lowball these AAVs, these cap hits as much as possible to squeeze in maximum roster players to account for injuries, etc. But if the cap is growing at 8-9 million, and they've already told us out loud it's going to do that, isn't there more pressure on Connor McDavid right now, maybe more than any other player, to get away from this 7 and 8 year guarantee and get himself into a situation where his percent of cap on an annual basis is as maximized as it possibly can be?
Yeah, I think so. Why not? I mean, if the league is telling you where the maximum cap is going to be, I mean, like you said, in the NBA, we already know essentially where about the cap is going to be in 2026, 27. So
Yeah.
we're already projecting what Victor Wembanyama's extension is going to be. We already know what Luka Doncic can do after this extension and how much he can make essentially when he gets to that point. So, and that's what makes the NBA flourish, is because everybody knows the numbers and we can project and see where things are going to go. You know, we already know the Lakers are, you know, at a point where the cap is, they're going to have a ton of room. They're going to have a ton of cap space to have to spend. If the NHL is finally getting to that point, that's a win-win for fans, for the players. So if Connor McDavid does the 1 year and then a 1 year, like you said, you know, barring any injuries, that's a win for the NHL, for players. It's shocking that no player has maxed out on their percentage. So, you know, if McDavid is the person to do it, he seems like he should be the player to do it.
I can't go out on record and say that it's never happened, because I just don't have in my brain right now, you know, NHL salaries going back to super far, Scott. But it hasn't happened in the most recent iterations that I've been following with this stuff. And certainly McDavid didn't do it last time around on a $12.5 million cap hit, right? And for the most part, the reason it doesn't happen is because they spread things out so much. Okay. So, I mean, you and I have had this conversation ad nauseum with every sport, right? I've been talking about it with baseball and football for forever. The second Mahomes signed that 12-year extension in Kansas City, I almost shut down the site. Okay. Because I was so mad that the best player, the most athletic, marketable player in the sport went that route with this contract. And by the way, you know, he hates it every day right now. He hates it. So shouldn't we be having that exact same conversation with McDavid right now, who has done way more than enough to prove that he is in that unicorn status right now with this league? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it could not have said it's I can tell you right now, and this is a hot topic, obviously, for a lot of reasons, but the WNBA CBA expiring when Caitlin Clark's rookie contract is going to end is this. It's worlds colliding at the perfect time for the players associations, agents, and the players themselves to put their foot down and say, we have got to make the changes happen right now, because it's the perfect storm. And I don't think McDavid's that kind of guy. And I know nothing about the agencies that represent him, but they have to be having these conversations, you know, even behind the scenes, certainly not publicly, saying, we just can't let this one slip away. It's all right there for us. You know what I mean? Now, is he going to hate that it's going to hamper his team, right, from being able to sign 2 or 3 minimum salary veteran players? Yeah. And by the way, there's a hell of a lot of examples in the NBA that you've been following where that's exactly what's happened. Kobe Bryant was a $42 million player, right, rehabbing from an ACL or an Achilles injury, and the Lakers couldn't properly backload the roster because of his cap hits, because of the situation, and they were terrible teams to finish off Kobe's career. So I get it, but sometimes business has to supersede the sport. And hockey has never been that kind of league, never, for a lot of reasons. It's funny because these guys are monsters on the ice, but maybe a little bit too nice off of it. That's always kind of been the mantra for hockey players and maybe the teams and the fans and the leagues that go with it. This is that one time where McDavid has to put his foot down for the betterment of the Players Association and the players respectively, and say, look, if Minnesota just caved on Kaprizov, right, with $17 million over an 8-year span, then certainly Edmonton can go 3 or 4 years or 2 years at the max 20.8, right, and make everything else work. And we're just going to have to deal with that. Do you think we get there, knowing what you know about this? And I'm going to follow that up with an NBA question. So,
well, I would hope that you know, as you were speaking there, I'm thinking, you know, if Connor McDavid took a 1-year deal,
yeah,
he's the best in the league. He's the superstar of the league. He's the face of the league. That's going to force all the other teams to adjust their cap space, because there's a chance that if Edmonton and McDavid want to part ways and McDavid wants to go somewhere else, maybe he wants to go to Florida, because those Florida teams are, juggernauts right now. They may open up that space or do trade deadline moves like the NBA does to do pre-agency to be able to bring him in and then sign him maybe on a 2 or 3 year deal. Maybe he only wants to do the 1 year deal, because then you're, like you said, LeBron Jamesing it, where you're maximizing the 20% every year. So it opens up not only from the financial standpoint, where it's going to help raise those younger, salaries, perhaps. Someone's got to do it. Hopefully it's not the Kirk Cousins or the Deshaun Watson situation where, it backfires, but I don't foresee it in this case doing so.
Yeah.
But I just think if McDavid is in the media's spotlight year-to-year basis,
it's huge.
NHL is in the spotlight. If McDavid goes and signs an 8-year deal, it's sort of like Bryce Harper. He went and signed the deal.
Mike Trout.
We forget all about him.
Yeah.
So Mike Trout, exactly. So if McDavid is even a 2-year deal, and he's back in the limelight in 2 years, that's great for the sport. So
how much more interesting would the Chiefs be right now if Mahomes was out of guarantees?
100%. Yeah.
Right? We wouldn't have Mahomes fatigue. We wouldn't have Chiefs fatigue.
Yep.
We'd be thinking more about his future, like we do with Dak Prescott every 2 years, because that's how his contracts are structured. That alone, right? What you're saying, maybe the 1 year contract is insane. Maybe that's just, from an injury perspective, that's just too much. And by the way, I don't think a team would ever do it, because then there's no way to trade that player. And you want to at least keep that option open. That's why in the NBA, the 1+1 that gives the option, keeps the term to make the player tradable, at least in the offseason, is valid. Well, the NHL doesn't do that. Okay, it's fully guaranteed everything out of the.
So are there no player options?
No, it's just not. That's not how this league operates. So, I think at minimum we're talking about a 2-year contract, which is fine. I know a 2 for 42. Yeah. That's not going to break anybody's bank. I'm going to give you a couple other things, and then I'm going to ask you an NBA question. Remind me about the NBA if I get off on a tangent. What I'm about to break down with the CBA, almost every single change that I'm going to break down, which is about 8 of them, has to do with the fact that the league clearly doesn't think teams are using enough cap space. And I can tell you right now, the season's about to start. There's 7 teams with at least 10 million of cap space for this season. There's 11 teams with at least 5 million of cap space for this season. That's a player. That's like a real player in this league. Okay. A $10 million cap hit is 3 players this time of year that teams aren't allocating or haven't allocated properly across their 23-man roster.
But aren't they not allocating that money because their injuries happen so much?
Injuries, bonuses.
Yeah.
There's certainly a more practical matter to it. But there are at least 5 to 6 teams that are just flat out not spending to the cap this year right now. Okay. But dropping the max contract from 8 to 7 years, 7 to 6 years in free agency, that's a cap move. That is the league saying out loud, A, we don't want our players pigeonholed as much. And B, you should be able to afford the proration of a 6-year contract versus a 7-year contract because we have raised the salary cap, right? They're saying that out loud. They have changed a big part of the trade. So right now, and it's been really fun every February, there was no limit to the amount of teams that could get involved in a transaction in terms of retaining a cap hit. And what was happening is you were seeing a player traded from team 1 to team 2 with retained salary, and then immediately traded to team 3 with more retained salary. And sometimes the team 4, which is the team that actually wanted the player in the first place, but needed help from other teams to retain salary once or twice over so that team 4 could get the player on the cap hit that they could afford for the remainder of that season. That's gone. The second now a player's salary is retained, there's a 75-day restriction on that player being retained from that point forward. So again, That's the league telling us out loud. You can afford that full cap hit. Take it on. In other words, basically everything that's been done over the past 18 to 24 months, negotiation-wise, obviously league-wise, is telling teams you need to be allocating more salary cap. You need to be doing better by your players and by your roster, and you can be handling more at one time. This spreading out and proration stuff probably has to go away, something I think the NFL is about to get into. So, having all that in mind and the McDavid stuff in mind, we've kind of gone through a couple phases of this with the NBA now, you know? And by the way, where this went with the NBA when the league tried to dismantle Golden State because they super teamed themselves off the cap balloon, that just happened with Florida, with Carolina, in the NHL, with Tampa Bay. The NHL just had that. And this is an absolute reaction to what the Florida Panthers have done with their long-term injury reserve, their playoff cap, all the stuff I'm going to get to. This is a reaction to super teams in the NHL. Very like what happened with Golden State in the NBA. It's why the aprons exist and all that. But now it's been a minute since then. And it seems to me that the short-term contracts in the NBA are starting to dissipate a little bit. Is that actually the case? Are they going kind of back more towards long-term contracts in the NBA? And if that's the case, do you have any reason for that?
No, I don't think they're disappearing. I think it's just how the structure in the NBA is happening. We're starting to see free agency is not as potent as it used to be. So we're starting to get extensions where you know, if there's 1 year left on the term, they can go to 4 years, add 4 years, or the 3 if they wanted to. You know, for the designated veterans, they can go up to a maximum of 6 years left in total. So if they have 2 years left, they can add 4. If they have 1, they can add 5. So there's jockeying of certain players not signing, as you know, they're waiting to sign so they can get the longer term in some respects. But I think as a whole, if I had to go back and look at the free agency, my guess is probably the majority of them are between 2 and 3 years. There's probably a couple 4 in there. But I think knowing where the teams are being smarter with how they're handling their contract structure because of the aprons.
Yeah.
But you're going to start to see some of these teams that are towards the top. Minnesota's, Oklahoma City's going to have to do some work probably in a couple of years because they're going to be so deep into the tax and dealing with the aprons. They're going to be handcuffed from what kind of moves that they can do. So the NBA actually has kind of probably shifted more towards the shorter term because we only want them to be on the roster for so long and then re-up them. But if we need to get off of them, they're structuring, Jonathan Kuminga is a great example. It's a 2-year deal. The last is a club option, but it's $22.5 million they're about there, where that's easily salary matched in the NBA right now, where they can flip him for something. So there's definitely teams don't want to have 6 or 7 years of salary unless it's a designated SGA type player where you want him long term. But otherwise, we just saw rookie scale extension 4 years for $62 million, and that's just above their mid-level exception value. So
a lot of that is top down, though. A lot of that is they've added these cap aprons to shorten the windows of teams, right? Even super teams like the Thunder and things like that. There's just a cap on wrong word. There's a threshold as to how long that team is going to be able to stay together because of what they've done from a luxury tax standpoint.
Right.
But from a contract term standpoint, there was definitely a moment when most of the superstar players were foreboding 4-year contracts, 1-year contracts with player options, or 2-year contracts with player options. It feels like the very, very 1-year deals have all but gone. It seems like players want to give themselves at least 2 years of full guarantee and then the option. And I just wonder if that's the players and the agents making that change, or do you think it's been the teams just saying, I'm not doing 1-year deals with superstars anymore. That's not good enough business for me to be able to game plan, especially with these aprons and the cap situation. It's just not enough runway for us to have with a player to be able to budget for multi-years.
Yeah, I think it's more of the flexibility in the trade market at this point.
Okay, this is exactly that's the answer I was hoping you were going to give me, because don't you think this is where there's no question that all these things we're talking about in the NBA took free agency and threw it out the door, and quadrupled the trade deadline and the offseason trade market, at least, right? I mean, that's the only way to operate now in the NBA, Scott. And it's because of everything we're talking about. They shortened contracts, which means more players were on expiring contracts, right? Which meant that you had to decide immediately if you wanted this player long-term on your roster, or if it was a better value to get a trade chip for that player right now. And if that's the constant conversation with the best players in the league, that's how teams are going to operate. So you're going to be allocating cap space for trades, not for free agency. That's where the NHL has to go here, right? And it's not, I hate to sit here and say that, Connor McDavid should be on the trade block every 3 years, because that's tough for fans. It's tough to be an NBA fan. It's getting tough to be an NFL fan with how much movement there's been. And I hate to take that away from the NHL, but it is better business, right?
Oh, 100%, because you're always in the news. If you have these superstars that are on a 1+1 or a 2+1, there's at least the conversation is going to be there of, is that player going to be traded? Jonathan Kuminga did the 1-in-1. We know he's potentially going to be traded once his trade restriction is lifted. He's going to be back in the spotlight, and then that just spawns the conversation, the trade machine, whatever it might be. To go back to your previous question with the superstars, I think what we're starting to see is when they have a player option, typically, like Kyrie Irving, he decided to opt out so that he could get a little bit more guaranteed in a little more term, but maybe not as much as he would if he just picked up the player option and then got another year. And he was coming off injury too. So, but you're seeing some players. Chris Paul is a perfect example too. Back when he had a player option, he declined it, but then they gave him a little bit more guaranteed on top of it, but flexibility on the end where it was non-guaranteed. Obviously, the NHL is not like that, and they don't have the options. But if we're talking about maximizing contracts without having to go 6 or 7 years, that sweet spot is probably 2 or 3 years. So that every 2 or 3 years, it's not only good for the team because then they can renegotiate if they wanted to keep them, but from a player standpoint, if the team's not good, you're not locked into it. And then you're not necessarily having to deal with the trade gymnastics at the trade deadline. And like you said, now
which got harder. Yeah.
Which are harder. So if you're maximizing I'm going to be here for 2 years, but if things go way south and we're just at the bottom and we're in a lottery team every year, I'm going to go find someone that has cap space. The NBA, in talking with Keith, when he does his projections here for 26, which are probably going to be fairly soon after these rookie scale extensions probably hit here in the next 2 weeks, he'll probably do a new 2026 spending projection. I believe he said there's probably going to be upwards of 10 teams with cap space going into the 26 offseason as of right now. So there's going to be some cap space where free agency may be a little bit more, and that's, that could change with extensions during the season or whatnot. But I think if the league is saying use your cap space, that's a good thing. It's sort of like, giving them a floor without saying there's a floor there.
And there is that, all that stuff exists. They've done a better job than Major League Baseball in kind of renovating themselves and making sure that there's parity, and there has been, but things got a little wonky with this Florida Panthers situation. There's no question that that's the team that kind of broke this camel's back a little bit. And all I could think about as I was reading these articles was, this is exactly what happened in the NBA. Exactly. One specific team, despite how popular they were, probably was on track to ruin 15 to 20% of the league's parity and possibly ratings and advertising, right? I mean, if you put all of your chips into one basket, even as a league, that can be dangerous if the wheels fall off, or if Steph Curry got injured and Golden State was the only team that mattered, that's troublesome, right?
Right. And all these apron teams came into play, and look at what happened. Boston had to make some moves. They had to trade pieces because the apron was in play. Otherwise, if those apron rules weren't there, those players are likely there, even though Jason Tatum is injured. They're
Indefinitely. These are 28-year-old guys. I mean, they're there for maybe 10 years if you don't put these kind of guardrails up. So I think it's done its job. It's annoying, and it stinks from a fan perspective because, it's going to be tougher to fall in love long-term with players, but I understand it.
But you have to be cognizant of the future. Oklahoma City is a great example.
Yeah.
They're looking 6-7 years ahead with all the picks that they have, but they've looked at the now, and they're landing players in trades, free agency, whatever it might be, for the now, and they won the championship. But they also have enough draft picks down the future that if they need to move off somebody, they may be in a spot where we can sell those draft picks or we can use them. The NHL, knowing that the cap in 3 years, they already know their cap space. They can project way better now, similar to the NBA, where, all right, we can allocate this much cap space, or we're projected to have 40 million in cap space going into 27. If we move these players, then that cap space opens up. It's a good move from the league because teams can really operate instead of waiting until the 11th hour to find out how much cap space what the cap's going to be and how much cap space they have. They can now really truly project forward and make those moves accordingly.
Well, and that's, to put a bow on it, that's the other reason Connor McDavid does a 2-year deal here. Is I've done my job. I've given you the discount one time over. I've outperformed my contract, obviously. I'm going to max out at 20%, and I'm going to do it over the next 2 years. And that's my expiration date. So build a contender over the next 2 years here, or I'm going to have to walk away. I mean, that is the business magic that LeBron James has done for the past 21 seasons in the NBA. That is what he's done. You hate it, love it, but you have to respect it, okay? Because he's made a boatload of money. He has produced past his contract basically everywhere he's been, including right now at 40 years old. And he has put pressure on his front office every single year to maximize the roster, to maximize the contention window. And I think Connor McDavid also deserves to have that kind of power and yield that kind of power with the Edmonton front office or wherever the hell he ends up in the next 12 months. Because I guess I can't assume anything here.
Can I ask what happens after the 3 years that they've already put in for the cap? Is a renegotiation? Is there a percentage after that 3 years? Do you know what happens?
What I've been reading with most of these changes, and I'm going to run through them quickly with you here so you're in the know, is that there's basically a moratorium after 3 years, and they can readdress, they can look at everything that they've gone through, and they can adjust as needed. So I don't think they have a full handle on where the advertising and the TV rights and things like that are going to be in 4 years. So they don't feel comfortable with any kind of percentage increase yet, but I'd be hard pressed to believe it stays on like a $9 to $10 million increase going forward. But I hope it does, because that means things have gone right. All right, quickly, you ready? Do you know anything about what's changing in the NHL, by the way?
Very little.
Yeah, I don't think many people listening do. So hopefully you're still with us here. They're going from an 82 to an 84 game season. They're eliminating half of the preseason, and they're adding 2 regular season games, which obviously adds revenue and should increase some of these players' salaries, of course. And in order to reduce the workload, if you have 100 games of experience, you can only play in half of the preseason. You're only allowed to play in half the preseason. And if you played in, I think, 50 games the season prior, you're capped out at how much training camp work you can do. So you can only put in certain amount of hours at training camp if you played X number of hours in the season prior. So they're putting some guardrails on the player's workload, understanding that I think the overall goal, and maybe we might see this next year, is they want to move the start of the season into September. because we're in that kind of lull right now, right? The NFL is in week 4, right? College football has had their big opening weekend boom and Labor Day boom. This is kind of a nice spot right now, today, for the NHL to be kicking off their season. So I would expect in 2026 us to be talking in the first week of October about the start of the NHL season, now with an 84-game regular season schedule. Now we're going to get super nerdy, so buckle up. All right. So one of the biggest problems that had to be fixed here with the CBA is the long-term injury reserve, which has, as you know, a brutal calculation system in terms of cap and the bonuses and players that were added versus what the salary cap was that was sent on the injured reserve and how long that player was on the injured reserve. And for lack of a better term, teams were manipulating that process. They were putting expensive players on long-term injury reserve, even if those players maybe didn't have 60-day injuries, and then backfilling the roster, especially at the trade deadline, loading up on players. And then once the regular season ended, they would activate those players off long-term injured reserve, and they'd have this bounty of a roster for the playoffs that was number by number well over the salary cap threshold, but it didn't matter because it no longer counted. So they made 2 significant changes to this process. The first is, in the season, when you put a player on long-term injured reserve, the players that you add to replace that player or players you add to replace that player cannot have a combined cap hit that is more than the long-term injured player you just designated. Makes sense, right? How about this one? Additionally, if that player is a high cap hit player, right, like a $5 to $10 million cap hit player that you just put on the long-term injured reserve, the players that you use to replace him cannot add up to an average cap hit that is more than the average NHL cap hit from the season prior. And the average cap hit last year was about 3.8 million. So in no LTIR instance during this upcoming season can you add players that add up to more than 3.8 million to replace a long-term injured reserve player. And all of this will be followed transactionally by the league, kind of like an add subtraction system.
Yeah.
Which sounds like a freaking nightmare for people like you and I who do this stuff daily. But if this is what they decided is going to, close that loophole, God bless them. Here's the one that really makes
I don't understand. Let me interject that.
Yeah,
I don't understand why the NHL just doesn't have like a roster freeze date. Like the NBA has a roster freeze date.
I completely agree. If
you're waived or whatever, after a certain point, you are no longer playoff eligible. It seems like something easy to add in.
So they kind of went a little bit more sophisticated way around that. I think this is going to help what you're talking about. So the playoff cap allocation is this brand new system. Okay. Prior to the start of a playoff series, if your team makes the playoffs, like hours before, I think that's like a 4-hour window, you have to submit a 20-man roster to the NHL, to the league, 18 position players and 2 goaltenders. And that 20-man roster has to have a combined salary cap that is less than your team's adjusted salary cap, which is this year $95.5 million minus any bonuses, any retained salary you took on, any buried minor players. Okay, so basically your end of season adjusted salary cap, which could be higher or lower, you've got to fit your 20-man playoff roster into that. Now you can adjust that playoff roster with injuries and whatnot, but everything's got to be approved by the league. Every single playoff series has to be approved a 20-man roster.
Just by series, not by game.
Yeah. I think there's going to be exceptions, obviously, but let's just, for lack of a better conversation here, let's just say there's a playoff roster salary cap, and it's got to abide by your adjusted salary cap for that season. That's a great move.
Mm-hmm.
It's an awesome move.
Yeah, it is.
And I think it's going to eliminate, the super teams of Florida who were loading up on both LTIR players plus trade acquisitions, plus buyout players, plus all that stuff, right?
Well, I think if it works out, other leagues could adopt that to a certain extent. Like, NFL, they're signing guys in the playoffs that are have been waived, and they're adding them to their.
Why have fantasy leagues figured this out, but not the actual league, right?
I know.
there's an ad deadline, and the league doesn't have one. So that's a good one. I talked about the retention. There's now a 75-day retention restriction on a salary that's been retained. I like that. But from you and I, the data guys over here, I'm just anticipating this, because if that happens at the trade deadline, I don't think there's 75 regular season days left in that season, which means that this is going to span into the next season, which means we're going to have to keep track of 75-day windows when this stuff happens over multi seasons at a time. Just sounds like a huge pain in the ass.
Unless it's 75 calendar days.
No, they made it very specific that it is regular season league days. So once the regular season ends in April, you stop counting and you start back up in October again.
Does it specifically say it will rotate into the next year? Or
yeah, it says many instances will span multiple seasons.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it does. So data nightmare again. Here's a big one. I think this was kind of obvious. You probably don't even know, but over the past 2 seasons specifically, it's not new, but over the past 2 seasons specifically, deferred contracts have become in vogue with some of the bigger players, especially out in Toronto and some things like that. That's gone. As of next year, that's completely gone. You can no longer defer salaries. You can no longer allocate massive signing bonuses and defer payments on that to the end of the contract for cash flow purposes. It's got to be a pretty by the book year-to-year pay structure now. And that, I think that benefits in a couple of reasons, but I can certainly understand why owners were trying to go this route. But, long story, we're not going to have an LA Dodgers in the NHL anytime soon here, where you can kind of manipulate the accounting things to work in your favor. That's been killed with this latest CBA. And then the only other 2 elements of mention here are the contract lengths, down from 8 to 7 to sign with your current team, down from 7 to 6 to move on to a new team. Hopefully that's not an issue, because most players start signing 2 to 4 year contracts instead with maximum salaries. And then the minimum salaries have taken pretty good jumps here. It stays at $775 for this season, goes to $850 next season, $900, $950, and then $1 million for the final year of the CBA. So they can at least hang their hat that it's got $1 million minimum salary within this version of the CBA going forward. So I don't think that's necessarily, quite there yet. But if you kind of run around the rest of the league, baseball's got similar roster sizes, 26 to 28 with the September call-ups. Probably more injuries to deal with. I think baseball ends up having about 45 or so. Obviously, they're 40-man payrolls, and then maybe 10 on average, 10 players injured. So 50 total players, and their minimum salary is about $760 going to $775, $780. So similar to what the NHL has constructed here over the next 5 seasons. Anybody thinking about NFL or NBA comparisons, you just got to stop. I mean, NBA's got a 15-man roster max. Most teams are going to run 12 to 14 throughout the season. There's no such thing as an injured reserve in the NBA. You're just dealing with it. So, I mean, you're talking about literally half of roster sizes. So, of course, what is it, 1.4 million this year, the minimum?
1.27.
Yeah, so almost exactly double what baseball and hockey have, because it's exactly double the roster size.
Well, in the NBA, they have a specific percentage of cap. I would love to see NHL and even Major League Baseball get to that point. I mean, what are we doing? I mean, you're telling me that in 5 years they're finally going to get to $1 million, yet they don't know the salary cap in 5 years. So, if they were able to structure a percentage for the minimum salary based off of those caps and put it cannot go below this if the cap for some reason happened to go down again or flatline, it's still based off of the percent. So, as these caps are going up, at least those minimum salaries are going up. So I would love to see that percentage. So just so it's standardized across every year.
I do agree with you. I definitely think, especially with the longevity of these minor league systems, my God, some of these guys live in the minor leagues for, half a decade. However, to bring back our previous segment, knowing what we know over the next 5 years, that this thing's only going up $500,000 a year or $50,000 a year, $50,000 a year, it's more reasons for McDavid to max out. Yeah. If we know that the minimum guys coming in, that the draft picks, that the players that are getting called up for, on entry level deals are in this threshold, then Connor McDavid should be making 20% of the salary cap, because teams do have ways with these kind of roster spots to allocate themselves properly, right? So just another reason for superstar players to max out in this league, in my opinion. But that's it. Those are the major financial changes to this CBA. There's plenty more. There's some equipment changes and some things like that. But I don't think that even the many casual hockey fans know that the length of the season is changing next year, right? I think that's how kind of in the weeds this stuff has been, and just how dominating some of these other sports have become.
Is there anything in the CBA that just talks about, more expansion or expansion fees or anything like that? Just curious.
It's in the docket. I wouldn't say it's close. No, I wouldn't say it's close. There's some franchises that may have to move, I think, before expansion happens. Mm-hmm. But I think for now, it's just more about tightening up the actual contract structure was easily one of the bigger targeted areas here. Yeah. And, it's going to be a prelude to where Major League Baseball is headed in the next 18 months. Because talk about having to change a financial structure, right? I mean, this is child's play compared to what baseball might have to get themselves into.
Baseball and WNBA, I mean,
which is already a mess.
Two leagues dealing with this. The fact that NHL was able to get this figured out. The NBA got it figured out a couple years ago.
Yeah.
Last question I have is there a opt-out threshold that they can rip it up and sort of reassess?
That's a good question. Let me do a quick Google search on this. I don't know if they've got a new one yet in this one, because it doesn't actually take effect until next season. But if I find that out, I will put that on the socials and let you all know. But seems like for the most part, there's a 3-year trial period with a lot of these changes, after which they can make adjustments to these new things as needed for the final 2 seasons or so before they get to it. But it seems like this thing's going to run through 2029, 2030 for the most part. And then we'll see after that. That seems to be where most of the data is leading to here.
Yeah, I mean, that's smart. We don't know where streaming, cable, whatever the heck is media rights are going to be in that year. I mean, we killed the NFL for how long theirs was, because we're like, what are we doing? You don't know where things are going to go. But I mean, The NFL is the NFL. But for NHL, I mean, it's probably a smart move.
Yeah, and ESPN has the rights through 2027, 28. So that would be that second year of this new CBA. So you could see some significant changes happen right before they sit down after that third season, right? And see where we go from there. So there's going to be a whole new media rights halfway through this. And hopefully that's a positive step for them going forward. But good on them getting it done. You're right. The WNBA is already messy. We'll see where that heads next.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, man. Talk to you soon. Thanks.